Malolele, and welcome to the Molna Project. I'm your host, Reina Kapilani Pahulu, and on today's episode, we'll be discussing assimilation. But before we get into the talana, if we could give a warm welcome to all of our wonderful panelists here today. Yes. So to start, who would like to give us a quick breakdown or take a stab at what assimilation is or means to them? Lucky, go for it.
So assimilation, from what I understand, is when a minority group or culture goes through this process of adapting the values, beliefs, or behaviors of a dominant culture, whether that be because they're immigrants into a new land or they're indigenous people being assimilated. But yes, that's the gist of it, I think.
Yes, thank you, Lucky. Yeah, so assimilation shows up so much, and again, all of us here are in the continental U.S. currently, and may have experienced the U.S. as as it stands in Hawaii as well. Um, but yeah, it shows up in culture. It shows up in music, media, spirituality via religion, and all of those things. What are some of your thoughts on like how that's shown up in your life, whether because your parents moved to the States and put you through that, or and what does that look like in your lives? And
For me, when I thought about like this topic and how it related to me, I like thought about the education system and like even in K through 12, like the different things that like we have to go through, but like there's also that barrier because like our parents don't understand it. And so we're like the first ones who have to go through it, like, you know, like SAT testing, like you have all these like rich white kids like getting all these prep things and like you're trying to find out how to like get these tests for free. And then you have to like figure out like, how do I even study for these tests? And then from that, just like going through the like process of trying to apply for like college, like, you know, our parents want all of this for us. That's why they came to the States. But then like they don't know the process and then we don't know the process. And then like we're kind of stuck trying to figure out like how to do all of it. And that's like what I was like kind of thinking about in like regards to like us being here in the States and trying to like navigate our way.
yeah, a lot of us are operating from that space where, and we talked about this in one of our previous episodes, kind of our standards of success and how our generations and our diaspora are approaching education and those systems, because it's not always one that is built with us in mind, really like even integrate into them. And so when we get into it, again, our parents have no ideas of how to navigate these things or how to like get us help and things. And so it's a scary complex. And um, I don't know, were people seeing like issues with themselves as well when they were trying to assimilate via education and things?
I'll speak on that. I think for me, assimilation has been a very bittersweet kind of part of my life. It definitely has had strong effects on my own personal identity. You know, being a first generation American citizen comes with a lot of complexities, just because you're kind of caught in this middle space. You know, your family grew up in their homeland, right? My mom is straight from Tonga, and then I'm the first to grow up here in America. And so where does that leave me? You know, who am I? I never felt Tongan enough, but I never felt American enough either, because, you know, even though I was born and raised here in America, there's still things that are a lot different from me and say my white American friends. You know, when I go home, my mom still, English is still her second language. You know, we are different. And so I think it's an identity thing. And I'm sure it's probably this way for a lot of first generation American Pacific Islanders. You just kind of get caught in the middle and you're not really sure where you fit into either space.
Right. Yeah. I think that's a huge component of, I mean, and any growing adult and human being, I think there's this constant question of who am I and what that looks like to self and the larger concept of the world. But yeah, it's an interesting place to be in where, again, you're part of an indigenous culture that has traversed oceans to like live in this new land that promises different things, but then we also don't have like the richness of that home and culture and things. I mean, we have our communities, but it's not the same as being back in the homelands. And so trying to navigate that while integrating who you are as a person with Americanness as a whole is it's a lot to take in, and trying to find that balance, I think, is where people find a lot of strife, because it doesn't always make sense, and there's no clear one way to really exist. But we also don't have much representation in that. I feel like that's a big thing for me. Like, I didn't see many Pacifica and or Pacific Islanders in media. Like, we had The Rock and we had The Rock. So it was what does a person like me growing up here in the US, I grew up in California, and I just never had versions of me that reflected what looked. So I think my most, like, the next best thing were Black people in media, because they weren't white, but they also weren't brown. They were just like the closest thing, and everything that they had presented, from like fashion to music to education and politics, like that was the closest thing to brown that we could get. And so I, for myself, like, and that's not to say that we get to appropriate Blackness and its culture just because of our proximity to it, but I think there's a nuance that can be shared there, because of, again, we grew up with these diverse communities, from Latinos to Blacks and the Asians, especially in these impoverished communities. And so for me, that's what I always think about when, in terms of assimilation, is representation, and then like who I was close to in the US. What about, I feel like a major component that we've discussed in kind of our briefings were like the religious aspect. What did people, how did that formulate in your minds, like who you are as a person, whether spiritually or just like in general?
I'd like to take a stab at that. So like in Fiji, I kind of feel like what my great ancestors felt like when they were brought in. So my Indian heritage were brought in by the British as slave workers in Fiji. And just a short period of time before Fiji gained its independence, where they became as part of the Fijian citizen. Regardless of them becoming a part of the citizen, they still maintain their culture. And so my family was caught between in the middle, where we either had to follow our Fijian traditions or we follow our Indian traditions.
Mm-hmm.
But we kind of, from what I understand from what my dad told me, they found a middle bridge where not just their tribe, not just their family, but the government kind of made it a bridge between any culture that enters. Right now, Fiji is known as one of those multicultural nations where they celebrate every single race holiday there is in Fiji. They celebrate Muslim holidays, they celebrate Chinese holidays, they celebrate Indian holidays, Fijian holidays. Even if we're not under the Great Britain anymore, we still celebrate their holidays. Yeah, and I was wondering why we keep doing this, and I just couldn't help thinking, why do we have to separate culture when we can just live amongst them and get to know like what they have to say? Coming to America, there's so many things that I feel like I was confused, like why is this happening? Like this is definitely, like, for example, like I would walk down the street and I would hear a child arguing with the parent. I'm like, that will definitely not happen in Fiji, man. You get slapped, or like you get the lickings to like get out of your house or something. But why? I don't understand it, but I believe that there is an understanding there. I just don't know it.
Yeah.
And like that's where we come in. Like, we not just trying to avoid them, but we try to rather understand why or what is happening within each culture,
That's an interesting point, and it's such a touchy one, I think, for us here in the States, because I think it's half and half, where like half of us believe in like doing away with corporal punishment and like not ever like spanking your kids, just like really trying to have conversations with them about like why their actions and behaviors are like potentially wrong. But then there are those of us who grew up quote unquote old school and like aren't afraid to like whoop some ass, you know, just to get it. You know, and so that's a difference in I don't know, I guess I would say values, which you had brought up in conversation as well, Joseph. Um, there's a disconnect, but I think there can be like, I don't know what the balance looks like in that conversation, to be honest, because I'm not a parent myself, but um, I thought for a long time that that was like normal. Like, yeah, you're supposed to get whipped. You're supposed to like get almost beaten because you weren't following what your parents taught you and told you to do. But now it's like coming to an understanding that like, you know, communication is huge. And if there are like very real barriers to that, like how can we resolve that without needing to like hit you physically, if that makes sense.
Right.
Um,
And I think also, oh, sorry, Rena.
Go for it, Malia.
I think also what's interesting when we're talking about like identity, it's a small part, well, as much as being raised in like a Pacifica household is, but even that, like in the values and the way that you're raised, it creates a dissonance like between you and all the other people you're raised around, you know, like just an example, like the white kids in your class are not going to be raised the same way you are. And that honestly, when you're forming in your formative, like elementary school years, like your identity, you're trying to find similarities. You're trying to, you know, connect, especially when you're seeing these people in the education system every day. And the way we're raised in Pacifica household is a huge like dissonance that kind of separates us. And whether that's a good or a bad way, it just creates this difference about how we see ourselves and how we see, you know, our classmates, our peers. So I think that's interesting that we've brought those two things up.
And then I think to add to that, an interesting thing too for me, there's also dissonance between the child and the parent at home. You know, it's interesting because I know that my mom wanted me to assimilate. She wanted me to be successful. In her mind, me being successful was me, you know, acting like these white people. She didn't teach me how to speak Tongan. She wanted me to act white. And then it gets to the point where as I'm an adult, even as a teenager, she'd look at me and say, "Why are you so white?" And it's like, wait, but you raised me this way. You wanted me to assimilate, and now I'm too white. Like, where am I supposed to fit in? What do you want from me? You know? So there's dissonance everywhere.
I think you brought up a good point about language, and I think that that's what comes to mind when I think about assimilation is the language may or may not have been passed down to us as like first or second gen, and that created a disconnect between us and the generations before us and the amount that we're able to communicate with them. And I think one thing for me was my dad is from Samoa, and so when he came to Hawaii, he said, I asked him like why he didn't teach us Samoan, and it wasn't that he didn't want to. He just said that community that he grew up around wasn't there anymore. You know, he's like, so I would speak to you in Samoan, but who would you talk to? Like, you know, where are you going to go with it? Like, right. And he's like, and it was hard for him to kind of articulate, like, how do I teach you something that I just know to be me? You know, like how do I explain that to you? And so it was just kind of, it wasn't taught, but then, so I know that we tried, you know, and we continue to try. But I think that was part of assimilating was you making those sacrifices, I guess, in order to do what needed to be done. I mean, each parent is different, but I think that was what comes to mind was language was a little lost, and we're trying now.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the most important factors, like when we're talking about culture, is language too, you know. Like just taking it like from a historical standpoint, the first thing that, you know, like white supremacists or the invading colonialism hierarchy, the first thing they take away is your language. Just look at the Hawaiian people. And when we move over into the US and you have these first, second generations trying to assimilate, it's almost a form of, you know, mental colonialism that's ingrained in us, that, you know, we're not going to pass on our language because it's not successful, because it's no use. And then that's when you create also honestly a type of internalized like hatred to yourself when you're growing up in those first generation, second generation homes, because you're going to school and you're in an English setting, and then you're going home in these indigenous language settings, and it's different, and you're tripping over your English words, you're tripping over your indigenous words, and you kind of start hating your family because they can't speak English, or because they don't fit in well, or they have an accent. And me being a second generation, I haven't experienced it fully, but I have seen the effects on, you know, my father and the way he talks about his own language and other first gen people. And it's kind of where you start to see that identity that we've been talking about, that like internalized hatred for our own culture, that wanting to be white, like Nadia was talking about, that, you know, aspirations of whiteness within our culture, that is a really, really negative part of assimilation.
I really like that point, Malaya, because that's literally the reason my mom gave me when I called her out and I said, why didn't you teach me Tongan? She told me, I've seen way too many kids here who can kind of speak Tongan and who can kind of speak English, and I didn't want that to be you. And so she chose English, and she said, I just wanted you to, you know, master one language. And it's so sad that parents feel like they have to make that choice. And then, like you're saying, that kind of shame is going to push them towards choosing English as that choice.
There is an Olelo no Eao, and I don't know if Nadia, you know it, but it talks in Hawaiian, it talks about like language being life. You know what I mean? And so without language, your culture dies. You know, and that's a very real reality for so many of people who from the Pacific Islands who have moved and tried to create a life here, is that there are a lot of parts of our culture that they had to sacrifice, or were forced to sacrifice. And yeah.
I just wanted to add that one of the things about assimilating and being a minority culture or group is that, like, we come from very communal societies, and then we're trying to assimilate into a very individualism or individualistic society. And so that there's like that inherent dissonance, like everyone's been talking about. And to put it in terms of like this question of identity, who are we? From communal societies like Samoa, Tonga, Fiji, so on and so forth, our identity, individual identity, is tied up in our group identity, or our identity as a social group, or as more than just individuals. It's like as an aina, or a family, or new, or a village. Whereas you come to America, there's so much emphasis on who you are as an individual. And so that there's this constant need for us to ask, well, who are we? And it's contextual, situation by situation. It's like, well, in this situation, I'm an extension of my family and culture. So therefore, who I am and what my needs are in this moment are not so as important as the family's needs, you know? Whereas if you're an American, if it's a more individualistic situation, then you're like, okay, well, this is a time where I need to speak up and voice my opinion, my needs, so that way this perspective or thing gets noticed. But a big thing too that everyone's talking about is like this idea of Eurocentrism, which is the centering of Eurocentric or Western ideas, Palangi ideas, right? And it's inherent because we grow up in this Palangi system, or this Eurocentric system. We learn about Eurocentric histories, the language, and so there can be this inherent like, oh, I'm better if I speak English better or with a perfect accent, you know, and so it can cause a lot of problems. And I think it's so important for us to remember those communal values aren't any lesser than the individualism. It's just, it takes critical thinking and conversations with our parents and then also our Palangi peers to kind of mitigate them, you know. So yeah, it's definitely requires constant discernment.
I think an interesting kind of piggybacking off of the conversation about language, the microaggressions we face as Pacifica people navigating a new space. In many of my jobs, so I've been complimented many times, even by like our own community, as being an eloquent speaker. And for me, what that means is that we know. I think those of us who have that ability, we know that eloquence and well speaking doesn't belong to whiteness and white people. Like that's just a human possible thing. But like there have been many times where it sounds so simple, but even like if we're breaking down microaggressions, it's like it's a form of racism. And so when I'm like being the best customer service person for whatever job that I can be, I'm getting like, oh, where did you grow up? Like, where are you from? And meaning like, you look brown, you look different, you look not American, quote unquote. Why is your English so good? You speak such great English. And I'm like, I was born in the US and I grew up speaking English. So there's that. And I'm smiling now, but in the moment, it's just like, how dare you? The audacity to think because I'm like entering this space just brown and I'm not supposed to know how to navigate English on my tongue just so like fluidly. Like that's egregious. And but yeah, so whiteness, I feel like again it's this violent thing that doesn't always have this over tone to it. It shows up in very seemingly minuscule ways, but it like chips away at your spirit when you're constantly being challenged. Like, how dare you be a brown person and potentially be educated or have a voice and know how to speak a language of all things. I don't know. It's annoying.
I'm so glad you brought that point up because actually that exact Fiapalangi is something like on the other side with our own people that I hate so much. And I feel like it's so damaging when used in the context that I'm talking about, you know, when you're using, you know, more educated words or speaking more eloquently in English, you get clowned in any type of Pacifica, you know, if you start using bigger words, they're like, whoa, like you're trying to be white. And it's like this internalized racism because you're associating becoming less like your own people to being smarter, to being better, to being, you know, more educated. And it's like, and also what was brought up before, like our histories, it like saddens me because, you know, Pacifica people are brilliant. They are so talented. You know, we were able to sail the seas before Columbus, way before Columbus, before the invention of a compass. Like there are so many of our own histories, our intellectual histories that are lost through assimilation. And then when I hear like family members, close family members, or people like calling me Fia Palangi when I'm trying to just talk about, you know, and it, like an educational milestone or something like that, it like hurts my heart because it's like that we ourselves are, you know, amazingly forward-thinking people, and only associating whiteness with brilliance is really detrimental to our own identity and how we view ourselves. And it also is very detrimental when people, you know, grow up in that, and you know, all your family members when you're growing up, you're hearing that language associated with being more white, and of course you're going to have internalized racism and think that the less and less I become brown in my mind, that's associated with becoming smarter and being more successful in, like you said, this individualistic society in America. And I hate it.
And then I can speak to, oh, go ahead, Joseph.
Oh, sorry. No, like kind of like what Nadia and Malaya and Reina has collectively said about how it's a self-identity and it's communication, and that all like gets together into this big pool of education, you know. And coming from, I guess what I was trying to say is, you know, definitely back in the days when our parents used to talk, or like there was a line of degree that we cannot say anything, we just have to nod our yes and say yes, you know. That's sort of cutting the communication from the children to the parents. When they want to speak their mind, they cannot, because it's just, maybe it's a sign of respect, maybe it's like we are just told what we needed to know and what we need to do. Versus the American culture, they have kind of nurtured their children to like speak your mind. Like your parent needs to know what you think about. So if I take a step back and I look at it, I'm seeing something good and something bad in both sides, you know, and then when I take another step back and I take a bigger picture, I see like in every single culture, in every single organization, relationship, there is something good, but there is something bad also. In our culture, something good, we learn about respect. But something bad, and I really hope they taught us this when we're young, is to able to speak your mind and not just be quiet. Because your parents weren't able to know like what the children is trying to talk to you. Now we take a step back into the American society, they nail that factor down. Like the children speak their mind. The children let the parents know that, yo, like this is what I feel. But something bad was maybe they did not know how to portray that message across, you know. When I was in PCC, this guy came up to me and I was talking to him like I'm talking to you guys right now. And he full on said, wow, same thing like what I think, Reina, you said, wow, your English is so good. And like, where you from? I was like, oh, sir, I'm from Fiji. Like with a bright smile, yeah. It's like, and he was confused, like, and I can tell in his mind, he thinks that maybe the islanders, we don't speak that well, but how is he speaking so well? At that moment in time, I took this as a method of education for him. Now I told him, like, yes, sir, we in Fiji, the national language is English. We are taught the right way. I mean, we have our own culture, but we also have the English culture as well. It's a very beautiful place. What he said still stuck for me till this day. I did not have any idea. I did not have any idea Fiji was that. So I kind of think that most of the people, not just English, not just other cultures, they just have no idea like what your culture is talking about or where you're coming from. They just have no idea because, I mean, it's America. I feel like America is disconnected from the world, and I wish they just break these barriers down and like reach out. Because once they do, they will know what's outside there, you know? Well, we know what's outside there, and we're coming in here to let other people know there's a world outside. You should go take a look at it, you know? But yeah.
Would anyone like to add to that? That was great.
I think I just wanted to add to that topic in general. On the flip side, my mom being, she was raised in Tonga and she's lived here in Hawaii for a long time. And her experience with people saying that her English is good, she has a completely different attitude about it. And she's so proud. She's told me, she's like, some people, they think that I'm from here. They think I was born and raised here. Like, they don't even know that I was raised in Tonga. And, she's proud of it. But from my perspective, that makes me so sad that she's proud to disconnect from her homeland, that she's proud that she's successfully assimilated. Like,
and I guess it's good to assimilate, as like what you said, don't disconnect from where you come from, because that's your true identity. That's who you are. Like, it's good to assimilate. Heck, it's wonderful to assimilate, but always remember where you come from, because that's where your basic foundation was ever born,
Yeah, don't get lost in that America bubble, right?
Right.
I'd also like to add, like, there are a lot of like intersecting influences that can, because sometimes it could be like an uphill battle trying to teach your kids a culture that you grew up in because you grew up in a village in an island that reinforced these values in a communal and a village. You know, they went to church and everybody they knew there, they lived with her. But then when you grow up in America, it can be like an uphill battle because it's just you and your kids, or maybe that one auntie and uncle. And I know my mom was a single parent of 9 kids, so it's like, not only did we not learn the language, but we also didn't get very much time with our mom, you know. And it was like, I hated her a lot growing up because, you know, there's that like, all my Balinese kids get their attention from their parents in that one-on-one relationship. But here, you know, I can't even like tell my mom something that's bothering me on a personal level, you know, because I have to compete not only with my kids, but with her work schedule, you know. And so there's a lot of, it's like, what are the resources, or what do they have access to help teach us the culture and our communal values in a foreign system, you know, that can attack our very way of life, you know. And so for me, it wasn't until I went back home, because I served the LDS mission, and I served it in Samoa, so I kind of like won the lotto ticket for serving missions, and so I was able to see the way that my mom grew up, and it was like a light bulb flashing, you know, turned on. And it still didn't make it easy to kind of, you know, resolve a lot of that childhood and emotional baggage, but it did help awaken me to that. My mom grew up in a different childhood than I did, with a different setting and system. And so I don't know, it is very complicated, you know. And I really like what Joseph said. It's very like easy to romanticize what happened, you know, or the childhood that our parents grew up in, especially if they migrated. But just as much as we see that there was good there can also be stuff that wasn't so good, you know. With those communal values it's very rigid. Like, there's a strong sense of belonging and security, but it's also harder to, if you are being oppressed in how do I say this? Yeah, like things like domestic violence and abuse, you know, it can be hard to escape some of those realities back home, unless you come here, and then it's a lot more accepted for women to go and talk about these things in a more public setting, or to hold people accountable. So there are a lot of like complicating dynamics that surround being, you know, growing up in the diaspora.
Thank you for that, Lucky. I think that brings up another point of conversation. Like, what are the taboos, like the things that you just don't do as a Tongan, as a Fijian, as a Samoan, that like you can get away with here in the US, if that makes sense? Anyone want to take a stab at that?
This isn't really like my place to talk, so like I want the men to talk about this, but I know for a fact that just being Pacifica in general, and we kind of talked about this in our grieving, is something that is like taboo and you do not talk about is your feelings as a man. And something that I love about America is they are so much more open, not only to talking about it, but to reaching out for resources, for therapy, for communal healing, for different avenues to heal correctly in any type of situation where you're suffering. And I know that in Pacifica households, homes, and especially like back overseas, like if you're a man, you just don't talk about your feelings. You just rub some dirt in it and you move on. And yeah, so if you guys want to talk about that, I would love to hear, but I know that that's a reality. So
I want to add to that, especially back at home, it's kind of across the board, even for children, or, you know, across the gender lines, because there is a hierarchy, and it's like the older you are, the more say you have. But so women and men, I think I failed to say this in the live about masculinity, is that children in general don't have a voice. You know, it's all about being seen but not heard. And so women too or young girls can experience that sense of oppression of not being able to voice if they're being abused or if they're feeling uncomfortable in the situation. So
yeah, I'd like to add on that. Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, last time I went, so you go.
Okay. I just wanted to add that, yeah, I do think that it's not necessarily a gender thing. Sure, it's probably stronger felt by the men, but you know, for me personally, like mental health we don't talk about that in the Pacifica culture at all. It's not a thing. And so I am in therapy right now, but my mom doesn't know that. And I wouldn't tell her because I feel like culturally she'd freak out. She'd be like, why? Like, why do you have to be in therapy? Like, what's wrong? Like, why do you gotta just, it's just not like, she's gonna think like, for her, I think she'd be ashamed. And it would just be this whole conversation that I just don't want to deal with. And so I feel like that's probably common for a lot of our generation who want to take care of their mental health. There's this disconnect because, for our parents' culture, they're like, we don't do that. We don't go talk to some stranger about our issues because for them, it's that communal thing. They're like, no, we take care of our issues within the household. Like, people outside don't need to know about that. And so I think that's one of those things like Joseph was talking about earlier. In the culture, there's good and there's bad. And that's one of those things we kind of have to find the balance.
I know.
Yeah,
In
going
Fiji,
off of
Let's have Isaiah and then Joseph.
yeah, let's go, Isaiah.
going off of that, like mental health, like, like all the way up until college, like, I had all these things, but like, I never really like talked about it because like, we don't have a space for that. We weren't taught how to do that. And so it wasn't until college that I realized like what I was feeling on the inside, and like that's also like valid, and like it's actually something going on. It's not just like just throw it under the rug, like don't suck it up, that kind of stuff. And so that's what I feel like happens like a lot with the older generation and our generation, is that like they still have that mindset, and even though like we're just trying to like open their like horizon, like their eyes, like it's considered like talking back. And that's like something also, yeah.
Joseph, you had some thoughts?
I think Isaiah almost nailed it, but I think that's why I really am grateful for the church in this case, because you have a voice with your bishop, you have a voice. Growing up in my household, same thing with Nadia. So like, my parents, they taught us to like, you make a mistake, that's your mistake, you deal with it, like make sure you correct it, like that's how you're gonna build your self-control, self-attitude, like all that stuff. But there are times where I wish I can just say something, and I say stuff to my mom, and I say I'm scared of my dad, so I trying to keep away from my dad sometimes. But like, when I think going to seeing the bishop, just having a chat with him kind of opened me up to be comfortable to talking to other people, except that's not my family. Because coming to America, to school for like 4+ years, and I go through stress, I go through a lot of crap, and I'm so glad that the church culture is same throughout the world, where I can go to someone that's not my family member, that I could have a chat with and not get judged about it, And the whole counseling idea, like, it's new to me. It's like, I don't know, coming from a different planet. and I just love the idea of there's someone that not just tells you what to do, but actually listens, sit down and listens, and like listens to you. That's all they do. And that's one thing good about this culture, about the American culture, is they have an organization just for that, because they know there's people out there that want to say things, that are feeling hard but don't know where to go. And that's what I really love about this counseling services they have here.
Gotcha. And just to clarify, you're speaking about the LDS Church, correct, Joseph?
Yes, I am.
Has anyone experienced the opposite thing? Just open conversation.
Joseph, you must have had a really good bishop, But yeah, I do appreciate that fact that the church does provide a wider community. When you travel abroad, there can be that safety net. Yeah, but I know of different cases where there are, especially in the LGBT community, because the church is still very, still negotiating a lot of it, or not negotiating, but still kind of don't know where they stand with a lot of those, their stances on the LGBT community. I have a friend who's in the intersex community, and it's like, if just saying intersex, not everybody knows what that is, but it's basically a third biological sex. They were born with both male and female organs. And so there are great intentions, but a lot of times there's inadequacy just because of lack of exposure to LGBT issues, and people in their congregation. So the policies that are in the church can be very harmful, and all the bishops have sometimes to go off of is church policy and leadership. So, but I do appreciate, because I've been to one-on-ones with bishops, multiple bishops, and they've always tried to give me the best of what they got, even if it isn't enough, especially myself identifying as a fafafine or third person gender from the Samoan context.
Gotcha. Yeah, I think the LDS culture in particular, it has a lot of great things about it, but it, as a blanket, doesn't cover all of us with individual regards, of which, it still remains to be seen. I don't want to get on here and bash the church for that matter. I think, take from that what you will. An interesting point of conversation as far as like tapu is navigating capitalism. And we see it with Asuelu on 90 Day Fiance, where this is a bit more of the extreme side of things, where a lot of us are, when we get to America and we get to these greater countries, quote unquote, that are more established financially, our parents and our like families back from those homelands don't understand like everything in America requires money. And so you have to live, you have to work, you have to pay and die by money. And so capitalism is a system that doesn't honor like our hearts. And I've said as much as well in past episodes, where like we see it in Asuelu in his clips, where he's like at a standstill between his family here in America and his family back home in Samoa, where like they are basically wanting to ostracize him because he's not giving them all of their monetary funds and things. And he's like breaking down, because if he does that, which he would like to in an ideal world, give them all of himself, much like many of us would do, but then he can't provide for his family. And then where is the balance in that? And like, I feel like if we all of us can relate to this at some facet, where our families can require so much of us because they don't understand how American capitalism or just Western capitalism as a whole system works. It just doesn't allow you to compensate wholly for your family and for self and for whatever you got going on in the US or wherever you're staying. Oh, but yeah, that's an interesting point for me. I don't know. Have people seen that in their lives, or what are some other topics that people are willing to talk about?
Oh, definitely. I feel like, we do still have a lot of family that live back in Tonga, and you can tell that they kind of romanticize this idea of their family in America, and they look up to us and just think that we are just rich because we live in America. And I think it's frustrating for them because they have this view of us, and then so when we're not able to give to them as much as they need or want, I think they're confused and they don't understand. Like, I don't understand. You have this great opportunity. You live in this land of bounty. Why aren't you taking care of us, back home? And it's like, we are trying to survive ourselves. And I think it is what you're saying. They just don't understand. And it all goes back. It's so deep rooted in this kind of this idea of whiteness being greatness and America being greatness. And so they think simply because we're in this country, we're automatically successful and we can automatically, provide for them. And we do as much as we can, but it's still, it's hard because we are trying to function ourselves.
So I'd like to talk about that from kind of a different perspective of like capitalism and our culture. So I'm a second generation Samoan, and most of my family now resides in California or America, period. There's still a lot of family in Samoa, but it's not as close. So we don't, have those monetary demands like a lot like in Asuelu's situation have. But one thing, like with my family here in America, that I know is a part of all, like just not just Samoan, but all Pacifica cultures is this kind of value or aspect of like giving without like asking for anything in return. So like kind of what we talked about for our last episode was this idea of like reciprocity is you're not giving because you're expecting them to pay you back anytime soon. You're giving because you know that's just what you do as family. And it can be, and I know that it's been proven time again for my own family, but I know in general in Pacifica households there is a value when you're growing up is like, oh, it's someone's wedding, like you're giving $100-$200. I've never met them, but that's just what you do because, you know, and there are also bad sides that can come to that because it can be too much or, you know, a show of who has more. But in the essence of it, it's you're giving because that's your family, that's your anga, like we were talking about, and that's your community, even if you like don't really know them. And that's not seen in America like at all. Like I would say mainstream like American culture is you pay for yourself, you give for yourself. Like if no one has supported you like during your journey, or if they weren't there to rise you up like in your dark points, then they don't really deserve anything at your high points, you know. But that's just like not the type of culture that at least I've seen here.
Oh.
And I want to say, like, the whole Kalani and Asuelu, I love the part that you brought about capitalism. And then it's like, we got to realize that, like, back home, they had lots of kids. And with lots of kids, that was like their labor force. And that's who was going to take care of the land and things like that, you know? But when Kalani came and took their only male child from the family, there was no understanding that that was a huge source of their livelihood. And that's just the way it works in communal societies, you know. And a lot of people who comment on Kalani Asuelu's situation and kind of bash on them was like, they don't understand the strong ties that we have to our parents. Even when we are married, our parents still have a strong say in our relationships. And that's just the fabric of Samoan society. And so when I hear like people doing, Palangi's doing reviews on YouTube and demonizing the mom because she's like, well, forget your kids, bring your son home. And I can see that sentiment because I don't know how much of it is exaggerated for reality TV, but at the same time, there is that strong bond that, and then of course, Kalani and her family being very Americanized, you know, they didn't understand. And especially the relationship between the sisters and the brothers, it's like, when Tanya was going after Kalani, he's like, I was behind Tanya. It's like, you go, because our sisters, when there's business between the brother and the sister, it's between them. And if your wife gets into it, it's like, ooh, you better. So I saw Asuelu was like, you know, what if my sister beats you? And I was like, okay, not the time, Asuelu, but so there does need to be a way of thinking that allows to see the strengths and weaknesses of both the communal Samoan perspective and the American perspective, because they only had 3 kids in their family. We had 9, and so yeah, it could be like, okay, what's one less son, you know? But in their family, it's like the only son, you know, and then another daughter lives in America. So what legs does the mom have to fall back on, you know?
I think when thinking about like a lot of, you guys all had really, really great points. The word that keeps coming to my mind when I'm thinking about assimilation and just like the different challenges it might bring is the opportunity that our generation has for balance. I mean, whether we liked it or not, we were definitely the middle ground, right? We're the middle ground for language. We're the middle ground for introducing mental health and all of these things. And I mean, luckily, I personally have never had to deal with that, those situations of like capitalism and sending money back home, because our families were both in the States. And but it just, balance seems to be the hardest part. Like a lot of us come to the States and we want to find that communal settings again, right? And so I think a lot of people, and I can't personally speak on like gangs or like affiliations in that way, but I know that that was just kind of where people ended up, right? Like you found people who reminded you of home, and you stuck with people who could surround you like your home did, right? And I personally have never been like gang affiliated, you know, like there's no real gangs in Hawaii. Whether or not they think they are, I don't know. But you know, like it just, I could see how when people went to like the continental US, how that was comfort. But then it's kind of like our generation has to like realize, or we have to be the ones to think like, are we going to keep like gang like this thing, or are we going to like pull back, you know, just balance in all things, in all of the challenges that assimilation has brought to life.
I definitely want to piggyback off of what you said, Misha. I think that, you know, it is interesting. You talk about, you know, the most difficult thing about assimilating, especially as first or second generation, is the balance. And it brings me back to, you know, when Joseph was saying like, you know, our culture back home, there's good and there's bad. Our culture here in America, there's good and there's bad. And I think a really cool perspective about that is that even though the balance is the hardest part, it's the most exciting part, because we're in a very unique position to be in that middle, you know, to exist in that middle and to take the good from both sides and to create something new moving forward. And, you know, when he was saying like assimilation is good, and that could be very controversial, but, you know, it is good with, you know, like if you're not forgetting where you're from, if you do take the good from this new culture and you keep the good from your old culture and you create something new. And that's what culture is. You know, culture is alive, it's constantly growing. And, you know, in our book club that I think Misha and Lucky are in, we're reading Teresa's Young Atonu, and something that really stuck out in one of her poems, she said, you know, just because the village says it's culture doesn't mean it's sacred. And that stuck out so big to me, because I think that's really hard, especially in Pacific Island culture, for us to say, but this is the way we've always done it. Like, this is our culture, but that doesn't mean that it's right. And also, if you look back even further, it might not even be the way that we've always done it. It might just be the way that the people alive now have always done it. But before that, it might have been something different. And so I think it's important to, you know, we have a special responsibility that we are standing in this place in the middle, and we can rise up from there and improve our people with this assimilation. So.
Thank you. I think to pivot the conversation towards our last conversation point is what incentive or what advice do you have for the generations upcoming, for them to want to learn about the culture, for them to want to invest, for them to want to know and understand the richness of it and carry it on? Because even the language component, again, many of us are first, second generations, and we aren't fluent in our homeland's languages, which is unfortunate. And it's still something that we can change in and of ourselves. But like, if we are struggling, how do we advise the next generations coming up? Like, hey, it is cool to be Pacifica, it is cool to be Tonga, it is cool to be Fijian, Samoan, whatever it is, to like, and you should want to learn it because of this. Like, what are the ways in which we can influence that, these generations, to do that?
I would say, go ahead, Joseph.
I guess you brought up a good point, Raina, about that. Like, I don't know, but if you see on social media, on the Twitter, there was this meme about going back to Asuelu. Like, we have the Samoan people hand Asuelu over to the Tongans. We have the Tongans people hand Asuelu over to the Fijians. We have the Fijians, you know. I was like, why? All the kid is trying to do is stand up, you know. I don't know. I don't know most of it if it's reality TV or just for reals, but the kid just trying to stand up. He's like, that's as real as it gets, you know. And most of the time I look at The Rock, not because he's rich and famous, but because how he came up. Like, if you listen to The Rock's story, like, he was rooted to this culture. He saw how he grew up. He saw how his mom struggled. You know, that was his incentive to like rise to the top. And like, if he can do it by maintaining his culture, regardless, like, he doesn't know everything about his culture, but you've seen his course throughout his life. He's always doing things to promote his culture. Like with the Moana Kea, most of his podcast was promoting Moana Kea. Same thing with Jason Momoa. He's Hawaiian and he promotes Moana Kea. These people are successful because they hustle to do what they need to do by knowing where they came from, you know? And like the advice I would give to my kids or like my generation is like, you do what you gotta do to succeed in life, but never forget where you came from, you know? And never forget the values you learned, because that's gonna stay with you through the end. That's gonna, and nothing in this world can take it away from you. That's your values and your culture. There's nothing in this world that can take that. Only you can choose to let it go, you know?
If
Thank
I can,
Isaiah and then Malaya.
I just wanted to say, like, an advice I would say is to don't be afraid. Like, a lot of times, like, you know, I'm not like fluent in the Samoan language, and like when I try to learn it and like I start pronouncing the words, I'm like, oh dang it, like it doesn't sound right. So then I just like give up, I quit, I stop. And like, you know, a lot of times I think like, oh, like, you know, my moves, my dancing, like, you know, it's not like graceful or anything. So like I give up. And you know, I would say, like, don't be afraid to put yourself out there. Like, you know, it's not going to be perfect at first. You know, you're not going to know all the traditions. You're not going to know everything about the culture at first. You know, just because you don't know everything doesn't mean that you aren't, like, you know, Pacific Islander, you aren't Samoan, you aren't Tongan. So I just say not to be afraid, to like keep learning. And, you know, for like the spaces where you don't see yourself, like, be the first one to be in that group, you know, be the first one to be a lawyer in your family, go into those settings. And, you know, just because they're not there doesn't mean that they'll never be there. You know, get your seat at that table, whether you have to be the first one or not.
Thank you, Isaiah and Malaya.
just so there, let me think, trying to get my thoughts together. Going back to what you guys were all talking about this balance and this new age that we're coming into America, and just like putting out a fact, like there are more Samoans living outside of Samoa than are living inside of Samoa right now. So like when we talk about this diaspora is our home now. Like there are more Pacifica people away from their home islands now more than any other time in history. And like when I think about it, it's like, you know, we traded va'as or canoes for airplanes. Like we are still like the original navigators, but we're just in different continents, different places. And now that there's a very increasingly growing amount of Pacifica people outside of our homeland, it's like, just for America, for example, if there's no representation, if there's no like we were talking about in the media, if our voices aren't there, where are they going to be? Because we're all outside of our homeland now. Like you can't say go back to your homeland. Like we're all here. Like this is our homeland now. Like this diaspora is what we've created it. And one of the things that truly like inspired me, like growing up, kind of not knowing my place, like we're talking about with our identity in Pacifica in America, one of the like best things that ever came out of my bachelor's degree was this one book by Apeli Hauopa, and he's a really famous historian. He's Tongan, and he came out with this book that I really, really urge anyone who's watching to listen, if you're Pacifica, to go read. It's called Our Sea of Islands, Rediscovering Oceania. And it's fantastic, but I just want to leave you guys with a little excerpt from his intro. And he says, Oceania is vast. Oceania is expanding. Oceania is hospitable and generous. Oceania is humanity rising from the depths of brine and regions of fire deeper still. Oceania is us. We are the sea. We are the ocean. We must wake up to this ancient truth and together use it to overturn all hegemonic views that aim ultimately to confine us, again, physically and psychologically.
Yes, thank you, Malaya. Let's go really quickly to Misha and then Nadia and close out with Lucky. Just some quick advice and or things for the future generations.
I think my advice for the future generation is both tied with family history and mental health, which are both things that I really love. I think that we can't heal generational trauma if we don't acknowledge it, right? And we can't acknowledge it until we know where we were or where our ancestors were. And part of that is learning who our ancestors were. I think that there are a lot of stories and a lot of life lessons that are lost when we don't know how to communicate with the people from our home or our older generations. And so kind of just to encourage the bridging of the two, again, to find that balance, and not to let all of their hard work, all of like the amazing things, right? Because Pacific Island people didn't have like written genealogies. We didn't have those things, right? But we do now. And so instead of letting all of their hard work go to waste, like let's, we're so vital in making sure that we survive, or their stories are told. But I think, yeah, just to be that balance, to encourage people to go to therapy, just gonna throw that in, because I think it's necessary. So yeah.
All right. I think I just want to echo everything everyone's been saying. For me, the best way that we can inspire the future generation is to show them. Representation is so important, and it is getting a lot better. We did just have The Rock growing up, but now we've got Jason Momoa. Now we've got, Disney's Moana. It makes me cry watching my niece watch Disney and see someone that looks like her, someone whose culture is like her. And that's so good, but we're just getting started. Like, we can't stop there. We need to open those spaces for that future generation. Like Isaiah was saying, don't be ashamed. Like, if there's no one that looks like you in that space, go be that first person in that space. And that's how we're going to inspire them, just by leading the way and showing them. I always say, you shame, you starve. They say that a lot in Hawaii, and I'm tired of starving. So we're going to feed ourselves, and we're going to feed our own.
Yes. Lucky?
Absolutely. Echoing all of that. And yeah, so along the similar lines of what Isaiah said, if not us, then who, if not now, then when? It's like, if we didn't have these places that taught us the language and the culture and our histories growing up, then it's up to us to build it. A lot of people who are bagging on Kalani and Aswelu are Samoan people. And it's like, well, what are you doing to better the community? What are you doing to control the narrative? We need more indigenous culture custodians. We need more, indigenous artists to create art, from an indigenous perspective, so that way people can see, the multiple different aspects of what it means to be Pacifica. And so, yeah, all that, decolonize everything, and throw some indigenous, including mental health, like Misha said. So, yeah, that's all I have to say.
Perfect. Thank you all. Yeah, my last closing sentiments are just that I see so much for us. I have such a dream and such a vision, like, of our names and all of the lights and all of the bookshelves and all of the faculty, whatever. I see all of our names in doing everything and being in everything. And so I have such a faith for that. And yeah, just don't be afraid. That has been a show. Thank you all for joining us. Please like, comment, subscribe, all of the things. Follow us on Instagram. And yeah, thank y'all. Bye.